One of the challenges for me as a film professor is sometimes when you're teaching older films, there are just a number of obstacles. Students don't watch films in black and white. Editing is slower. So one of the ways that I try to teach Citizen Kane is talking about the relationship between Charles Kane and Susan Kane as analogous to Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. What they do understand is a man with a huge ego and his desire to turn a woman who is sort of looked down on by society into something like high art. Framed that way, the students were all about Citizen Kane. They were all about that relationship. It was an easy way for them to get into the film and then to be able to see all of the really sort of amazing and beautiful things that Orson Welles is doing in the film.
Good evening, Mr. Kane.
I've had very mixed experiences teaching Citizen Kane, all of which have to do with how I framed it. The scene where Susan has her big opera debut and they keep cutting to the audience like talking crap, that's what it's like teaching Citizen Kane sometimes. Like, I'm Charles Foster Kane sitting there just like praying that they'll like this performance that I've put on for them, and they don't. Narratively, it can be a tricky film to get into because it plays with time, it plays with perspective. And they think that it's actually about the sled. They think that it's about that thing that gives meaning to the whole film, which is wrong, and the film tells us that's not what it is. But all of those things, I think, sort of set students up to dislike it from jump.
Bernstein, am I a stuffed shirt? Am I a horse-faced hypocrite? Am I a New England school marm?
Yes.
When I'm able to present the film as a film, not the film, then it's a lot easier for students to find their way in. So, what have you heard about this film? Oh, it's innovative. Why? Because it's like the only film where you can see the ceilings in a shot. But what's the function of that? And of course, the function is about the low camera angles, which are about sort of showing us Kane's growing ego and he's becoming this monstrous figure. Breaking it down to its parts makes the film accessible to students. I think one of the reasons that Citizen Kane is credited as being ahead of its time is because Orson Welles' own politics were sort of ahead of their time. His attitudes about labor, his attitudes about race relations. He and Lena Horne had some kind of thing going on, like well before interracial relationships were sort of widely accepted in society. And I think that, therefore, because his politics were so progressive for the time that he was living in, we tend to map that onto a film like Citizen Kane as well.
And they're going to get the truth in the Inquirer, quickly and simply and entertainingly, and no special interests are going to be allowed to interfere with that truth. I'll also provide them with a fighting and tireless champion of their rights as citizens and as human beings.
I think it also speaks to our desire to want to bring Citizen Kane into the modern era, that we still want it and need it to be relevant and to have some kind of significance for our modern day times.
With a million majority already against him, and the church count is still to be heard from, I'm afraid we've got no choice.
This one?
That one.
And so hence you get that weird interview of Donald Trump talking about Citizen Kane and like clearly not understanding the movie. The fact that we care how he understands this film and what this film might say about him, for instance, I think that speaks to sort of our desire to still like keep it in this hallowed space.
News on the march!
The way that it plays with the idea of media and truth from the very beginning is really interesting. So we begin with this newsreel, which we know it's propaganda. But because we know it's propaganda, it raises from the beginning the question about the veracity of the media. We cut from the newsreel, and we kind of have the reveal that they're watching the newsreel in a room, which I think raises another question, which is that the truth?
I am the publisher of the Inquirer. As such, it's my duty, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates just because they haven't anybody to look after their interests.
As Charles sort of moves from committing to telling the truth to really using it as his own, sort of personal, hype machine, it adds another sort of layer of, questioning the veracity of the media.
Really, Charles? People will think...
What I tell them to think.
It's a little scary to realize sort of just how relevant that aspect of Citizen Kane is for our contemporary times.
Are we going to declare war on Spain or are we not?
I don't find the lack of discussion of race to be a thing in Citizen Kane because I think it feels very accurate to that story world.
684,000.
It's a film that is about a rich white man dealing with rich white man issues, of course, which impact race, right? But which are not within his direct purview.
You never give me anything I really care about.
When Charles and Susan are on that picnic that she doesn't want to go to and they're arguing, there's the quick cut to the black singer's face.
It can't be love, but there is.
Part of the reason that it's jarring is because we have not seen any black faces in any kind of significant way in the film. But of course, he imports this black singer for this gaudy picnic with these people. It's symptomatic of another thing that he's collecting, right? He collects art, he collects wives, he collects, sort of black performance. All of that would make sense for that character.
49,000 acres of nothing but scenery and statues. I'm lonesome.
To me, the significant emotional moments, the things that humanize Charles, well, to me, those are always in relation to either his mom or his first wife or to his second wife. The women are the heart of the film.
Good night, Mr. Geddes.
Thinking about Susan, Dorothy Comingore, and what she brings to that performance, especially in her voice.
A piano?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's one in the parlor.
Would you sing for me?
Oh, you wouldn't want to hear me sing.
When Susan and Charles first meet, there's a softness and an earnestness in the way that it's shot. And of course, her character gets very shrill as the relationship goes on, almost unbearably so.
You're awful funny, aren't you? Well, I can tell you one thing you're not going to keep on being funny about, and that's my singing. I'm through.
But what that does is it sets up her return to that softness.
All the same, I feel kind of sorry for Mr. Kane.
Don't you think I do?
That's just such a grown folks sentiment. She loves him, she gets him, but she can't be with him. I understand why, my freshmen can't understand that. You need to have, lived life and had some failed relationships in order to understand, the gravity of the dynamic between those two.
Please don't go. No. Please, Susan. From now on, everything will be exactly the way you want it to be. Not the way I think you want it, but your way. You mustn't go. You can't do this to me.
I see. It's you that this is being done to. It's not me at all. Not what it means to me.
There's a lot in the less heralded moments of the film that I actually think make it so engaging. Even the physicality of Orson Welles. The cockiness and the confidence of young Charles, and then seeing his body change. Also, the way that he moves in his body is so striking to me. And looking at how Susan's makeup changes and her voice.
Get out!
I think Orson Welles sprayed something like down her throat to give her that sound of someone who's just been drinking heavily for decades. All of those little touches, thinking about what her life has been like, again, that the film keeps gesturing towards, doesn't tell us explicitly, but I think raises questions.
Come on, boys! The Union's
Be careful, Charles.
Kane.
Pull your muffler around your neck, Charles.
Kane, I think we shall have to tell him now.
Yes. I'll sign those papers now, Mr. Thatcher.
When Agnes Moorehead gives him away, it's heartbreaking. She's so stoic. And then when she calls his name, and it's like hysterical.
Charles!
You realize everything that she's holding back. It's a very interesting gender divide with students, because a lot of the guys will say, like, she doesn't care. And then, you know, the young women will say, no, she can barely hold it together here. It's just about her at that window. And the little asides.
What that kid needs is a good thrashing.
That's what you think, is it, Jim?
Yes.
That's why he's going to be brought up where you can't get at him.
Everything that's gesturing towards about his life. We don't need a whole bunch of scenes. In my experience, the stuff that I connect with Citizen Kane, the things that my students connect with, it's always like the emotional parts, right? Even the emotions that make us uncomfortable. I've had students laugh at Charles Kane in the scene where he's destroying Susan's bedroom. And I always ask them about that, like, what's funny about it? And some of them will just say, like, well, it's funny because it's ridiculous. And other students will say, I was laughing because it's so uncomfortable. And asking them to think about what it means to watch a film where the protagonist is made to look pathetic by the end, and we feel it. That's powerful. That's something that film today isn't necessarily doing. The way that I hope we think about Citizen Kane moving into the future is as a really great film. First and foremost, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what happens. I want to talk about the look of the film. I want to talk about sound in the film. I want to talk about the performances, because I think that a lot of those things get sort of glossed over because we're so busy, you know, like debating who the true auteur of Citizen Kane is. Rethinking Citizen Kane makes us rethink the canon, and it makes us rethink the formation of the canon. And for me, I don't necessarily want to knock it off its pedestal, but I do want to put canon in quotation marks, because I think we need to think about why certain things seem to be valued over others. What happens when we label certain films brilliant and better than everything else? Then we tend to credit them with a whole bunch of other things that are perhaps not only not accurate, but can really erase other film histories that were happening before or alongside the things that were happening in Hollywood. So when I've taught Citizen Kane in my film history class, I also teach Oscar Michaud's Within Our Gates. And every time somebody will raise their hand and say, wait a minute, but I'd always heard that Citizen Kane is like the first film to play around with time and to do extended flashbacks, but Oscar Michaud's doing that in 1920. It's easy to teach Citizen Kane because I can get Citizen Kane. That's harder with, let's say, early Black filmmakers like Michaud. Film preservation, film discourse, film studies can really like solidify the reputation of a film. And so some of this becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where we credit Citizen Kane, we credit Orson Welles, but then we sort of keep maintaining that narrative. And so it's not just a process of like what happened in Hollywood in 1941, it's also the discourses that are happening right now. I think the fact that we're still talking about Orson Welles in light of Citizen Kane and kind of making fun of his later like television and commercial endeavors speaks a lot to our own infatuation with classic Hollywood and our sort of hierarchical values of which media counts as being art and which doesn't. So I'm hoping that that's where the discussion goes. I don't know if it will, but that's my wish.